Grazie per essere qua, signore e signori, benvenuti alla serata inaugurale degli eventi letterari. Credo che la prima scommessa l'abbiamo già vinta perché non era scontato riempire questa sala con un ospite che, lo vedrete, incarnerà come meglio non si può lo spirito del Monte Verità, ma sicuramente non è immediato da approcciare. Ecco. Quindi grazie per essere qui. Io comincio rubando una frase che ha detto la nostra presidente, quella del Film Festival, ad una serata a Londra qualche settimana fa, quando con Giona Nazzaro abbiamo presentato la nostra retrospettiva della prossima estate, e la frase è stata "Today I'm nothing but a proud president". Fiero e grato lo sono anch'io per una serie di motivi. Innanzitutto perché se possiamo essere qui oggi è perché abbiamo il supporto morale, soprattutto anche materiale, di tutta una serie di partner. Cito i partner fondatori, quindi il Cantone Ticino. Qui devo portarvi il saluto della consigliera di Stato Marina Carobbio che si era preparata, infatti il suo discorso lo pubblicheremo sul nostro sito adesso, credo, ma purtroppo è rimasta a casa con l'influenza. Ovviamente il comune di Ascona, Ascona Locarno Turismo, la Fondazione Monteverità e poi cito il partner principale, la Mobiliare, che così tanto fa per arricchire culturalmente questo territorio, ma anche tutta la Svizzera. Fiero e grato lo sono anche per la straordinaria squadra che organizza questa manifestazione, tutto il team di Carmen Werner con le sue alleate soprattutto e anche qualche alleato hanno organizzato queste giornate che si dispiegheranno in tutta la loro ricchezza, soprattutto al Monte Verità nei prossimi 3 giorni, quindi vi invito a seguirci soprattutto anche lì. Fiero e grato lo sono anche per la bellissima squadra della direzione artistica, a cominciare da una new entry, Giuliana Altamura, talento della, non emergente, ma talento della nuova letteratura italiana, pubblicata da Mondadori, i cui mondi si ritrovano, penso, perfettamente a loro agio in quello che è il tema di quest'anno, di questa manifestazione. Quindi l'anno ideale per cominciare per te, benvenuta e buon inizio. Poi Stefano Knuchel. Stefano di se stesso dice di essere uno che almeno ci prova. Io sono un po' meno modesto nei suoi confronti, lo considero l'ideologo ormai non più tanto segreto del Locarno Film Festival e sarà lui tra poco a dialogare con l'ospite di questa sera. E poi Stefan Zweifel, che arriva. Eccolo, Stefan, io che è il nostro direttore artistico da 3 anni ormai, non credevo, non mi aspettavo sicuramente di conoscere qualcuno nella mia vita capace di esprimere il suo dandismo bevendo Coca-Cola Light su un palco, ma di lui quest'anno mi diverte ancora di più il fatto che sia un freudiano, o peggio ancora un lacaniano, a curare un programma dedicato in qualche modo ai 150 anni dalla nascita di Jung e meglio ancora a dedicare a Jung un'esposizione che aprirà al Museo Nazionale sullo stesso tema, quindi sui 150 anni dalla nascita di Jung, nel corso del prossimo autunno. Questo mi porta all'ultimo motivo per il quale sono fiero e grato ed è ovviamente il programma che loro 3 hanno allestito per quest'anno. Non so voi, ma quando rispetto a quello che sta succedendo nel mondo leggo o non leggo quasi mai commenti basati sull'interiorità, rimango per lo più basito. Sembrerebbe quasi che l'interiorità non esista, esiste solo il mondo estroverso, per non parlare poi dell'inconscio, anch'esso completamente negato. Credo che alla luce di queste premesse non ci si debba poi neanche meravigliare troppo del risultato, una realtà piuttosto sgarruppata, eccessivamente estroversa e in qualche modo anche stupida perché lascia perdere o si dimentica dell'altra metà del mondo. Ecco, io credo che rispetto a tutto questo Monte Verità possa comunque portarci un antidoto, forse giocoso, forse anche solo effimero, che del quale spero potremo godere insieme nei prossimi giorni, ed è una buona dose di introspezione e di poesia. Grazie per essere qui con noi, buon festival e cedo volentieri la parola al sindaco di Ascona, Giorgio Gilardi.
Buonasera, bello vedervi così numerosi. Caro Presidente Raphael Brunswick, caro Direttore Artistico Stefan Zweifel, caro Marco Solari, graditi ospiti, cari collaboratori, spettabili autorità politiche, gentili signore, egregi signori, caro pubblico. È per me un grande piacere e un grande onore porgere a tutti voi il mio più cordiale saluto da parte del Municipio di Ascona e il benvenuto alla 13ª edizione degli eventi letterari Monteverità. Io da fedele partecipante a tutte le edizioni, le altre edizioni ero seduto lì al vostro posto, dalla sua nascita ad oggi, come in un film, scorre ora davanti a me la ricchezza degli incontri che questa manifestazione mi ha sempre permesso di vivere, di far vivere, di condividere. È difficile fare nomi perché sarebbe poco rispettoso verso tutti gli illustri e le illustri ospiti che ho potuto incontrare e anche conoscere. Permettetemi però di citarne almeno uno, a nome di tutti, è David Grossman. David Grossman per quell'incontro e quel ricordo di quella mattinata trascorsa alle scuole comunali di Ascona con i bambini di prima e di seconda elementare, un gigante fra tanti nani. Incontri che hanno lasciato e lasciano il segno e mi auguro, e auguro perciò a tutti voi, e ne sono certo, che anche quest'anno avremo l'opportunità di vivere altrettanti incontri significativi. Psicogeografie è l'accattivante tema che vuole stimolare la riflessione, il confronto e l'incontro con personaggi che ci raccontano della stretta relazione interiore fra uomo, ambiente e società. Temi che ad inizio Novecento avevano portato al Monteverità filosofi, pensatori, artisti e scrittori. Al monte avevano trovato un ambiente ameno, idilliaco, dove l'interazione con la natura si poteva esprimere con esperienze di vita diverse, anticonvenzionali, dove lo spazio fisico e lo spazio sociale assumevano nuove dimensioni. Più di un secolo dopo siamo qui ora per confrontarci sui medesimi temi che assumono sfumature sì diverse, ma restano di grande attualità, pensando alle mutate condizioni del rapporto dell'uomo con l'ambiente sociale e fisico in continuo e rapido mutamento. Permettetemi infine di sottolineare come eventi come questo assumono e dovranno assumere in futuro sempre più importanza, sì per i temi trattati, ma anche come occasione di incontro fra gli scrittori e le nuove generazioni. E questo mi permetto di dirlo perché, ritenuto l'avvento dell'intelligenza artificiale, non vorrei che le giovani generazioni crescano con la convinzione che sia un'entità digitale a scrivere i libri. Facciamogli conoscere gli scrittori, facciamogli sapere che dietro un libro vero, c'è una persona che ha una voce, che ha un volto, che ha una mente pensante, che ha un cuore che batte, che prova emozioni, che ha dei pensieri e che scrivendo li vuole condividere con il mondo. Ed ora, a 150 anni dalla nascita di Carl Gustav Jung, per qualche giorno riviviamo lo spirito del monte grazie agli incontri che gli eventi letterari ci ha preparato e che ci daranno l'opportunità di vivere e sicuramente arricchire il nostro spirito e la nostra psiche. Ringrazio tutto lo staff, dal Presidente Raphael Brunswick al Direttore Artistico Stefan Zweifel e a Stefano Knuchel e Giuliana Altamura, a Carmen Werner e alle loro collaboratrici e collaboratori, e a tutti loro il più grande grazie e a tutti voi gli auguri per trascorrere delle giornate intense, stimolanti e soprattutto arricchenti al Monteverità. Cedo ora la parola al direttore artistico Stefan Zweifel.
Caro pubblico, buonasera e benvenuto a questa edizione dei eventi letterari di Monteverità. A 150 anni della nascita di C.G. Jung e a qualche passi della Eranos, della Fondazione Eranos ad Ascona, abbiamo scelto come titolo Psicogeografia, un po' difficile per me in italiano, psicogeografia. Abbiamo scelto anche questo un po' perché non è troppo vicino dal pensiero di C.G. Jung, perché anche io, come avete già sentito da Raffaele, non sono lacaniano, ma freudiano piuttosto. Non sono troppo vicino a C.G. Jung, non sono sicuro se esiste veramente un inconscio collettivo, non sono sicuro se esiste la sincronicità. Ma sul Monte Verità tutto è possibile. Forse domenica sera io sarebbe un jungiano ardente dopo la tavola ronda con Riccardo Bernardini e Madero. Forse penso, esiste veramente l'inconscio collettivo e vediamo che cosa io sogno nei prossimi giorni. Degli archetipi, non lo so. Ma la sincronicità esiste veramente forse sul Monte Verità, perché quando Raphael Brunschwig mi ha chiesto se voglio fare il direttore artistico, ho pensato, io non sono mai stato un direttore, non posso essere un direttore, e per questo c'è anche Stefano Knuchel e Giuliana Altamura che mi aiutano in tutto questo lavoro, ma in questo momento sono stato sulla terrazza dell'albergo la seconda volta al Monte Verità con la mia figlia che aveva 1 anno. Ho pensato, direttore, non lo so. E aveva un congresso su C.G. Jung e il libro rosso. Il libro rosso è splendido, è veramente un chef-d'œuvre totale. Niente contro il libro rosso, anche come freudiano. E la piccola è stata qua, un po' a 4 gambe, e ci sono state 2 donne jungiane del Sud America. Mi hanno chiesto, questa è la vostra bimba? Sì, abbiamo parlato un pochino. E hanno detto, questa bimba va a camminare presto, molto presto. E infatti 10 minuti dopo la piccola si alzava per la prima volta con una sedia e stava in piedi lì. Mi guardava e io ho pensato, forse è anche tempo per te, Stefano, di stare in piedi tutto solo come direttore artistico. Scusa un po' per le scarpe, non sono totalmente adatto ai pantaloni, ma sono le scarpe bene per la psicogeografia. Allora, questa psicogeografia che cos'è? Mi scusa che parlo di un signore che ho già parlato un po' su di lui 2 anni fa, perché abbiamo parlato a questo tempo degli alberi e della guerra, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Il svizzero Jean-Jacques Rousseau forse 250 anni fa ha inventato, senza saperlo, la psicogeografia, perché lui è andato fuori dalla città nei boschi e ha fatto le sue passeggiate e ha preso con lui delle Jazzkarten, delle carte di gioco, e ha notato tutta l'influenza della natura, degli alberi, sui suoi sentimenti, sui suoi pensieri. E poi racconta che una volta è entrato in un bosco molto denso, molto scuro, molto solitario, e ha visto dei pianti che non ha visto mai prima, ha sentito uccelli che non ha mai sentito prima. E ha detto, mi sentivo un po' come Cristoforo Colombo che ha scoperto un continente nuovo, un continente della prima umanità, prima della civilizzazione che è distrutta tutto. Allora sognava di questa prima umanità 1000, 2000, 5000, 10.000 anni fa, e subito aveva un rumore strano e è uscito dal bosco per vedere che cos'è questo rumore, e di colpo si trovava davanti a una manufattura di calze per donne. E poi diceva, questo è veramente l'essenza della Svizzera. Non c'è un altro paese dove la civilizzazione e la natura pura sono così vicino. e diceva tutta la Svizzera è in un certo senso un unico boulevard di Parigi, un grande boulevard. Allora, C.G. Jung ha visto la Svizzera tutt'altro. Lui ha detto che la Svizzera sono le montagne e di Jungfrau, la Vergine, è veramente il simbolo della Svizzera. E tutti questi valli strette. E per questo anche diceva, anche i svizzeri hanno un po' un mente un po' stretto e soprattutto nel nord hanno anche un ärgerliches Schweizerdeutsch e come tutti voi sapete è un po' strano questo Schweizerdeutsch. Komm Kind, komm jetzt, du musst nicht mehr länger spielen, komm in die Küche, ich bin gerade am Kochen. E posso dire, e lo racconto domani alle 2 per la seconda apertura del festival su al Monte Verità, Jean-Jacques Rousseau è totalmente d'accordo per questo che esiste nel nord. E penso anche che Rousseau e C.G. Jung sono d'accordo che, sarebbero d'accordo, non esiste, ma d'accordo che il Ticino è veramente un paesaggio molto adatto alla psicogeografia. E per questo domani sentiamo Tobia Bezzola del Museo Masi che parla di Carona degli anni 60 con David Weiss, Marcus Rätz, una colonia di artisti, Carona dove viveva anche molto tempo Meret Oppenheim come voi sapete. Poi sabato sera sentiamo i suoni strani delle pietre e delle piante del Valle Onsernone e anche dei elektrischen Drähte der Seilbahnen e poi andiamo un po' alla Fondazione Eranos, al Teatro San Materno e sentiamo anche tutto questo che Peter Zumthor e Laszlo Földeny pensano del Monte Verità. E tutto questo che Fleur Jecki ha scritto quando 10 anni fa è venuto per gli eventi letterari al Monte Verità e ha fatto un testo che leggiamo domani alle 2 e il sabato c'è un omaggio a Fleur Jecki che ha ricevuto il prezzo Gottfried Keller l'anno scorso e quest'anno il grande premio Grand Prix della letteratura svizzera. Con un concerto e una lettura di Patrizia Ziolkowska. Allora, questo è un po' il programma, ma questa Psychogeografia, che cos'è? Ich wechsle jetzt ins Deutsch, weil sonst geht das ein bisschen langsam mit dem Italienisch und Monika Carbone, die das für Sie übersetzt. Sie können jetzt das einschalten und so. Die ist schon ein bisschen vorgewarnt, was ich jetzt erzähle und ich versuche nicht schnell zu reden, nicht allzu schnell. Also diese Psychogeografie ist eine ganz seltsame Angelegenheit, die im Nachhall des Surrealismus 1953 von den Situationisten einer kleinen, obskuren Avantgarde-Gruppe in Paris erfunden und konstruiert wurde. Die Situationisten sagten, wir haben jetzt genug gehabt vom Surrealismus und all dieser Kunst in den Museen. Die Bilder müssen raus aus den Museen, müssen rein in die Bars und in die Restaurants der Stadt. Wir wollen keine neue Kunst machen, wir wollen einen neuen Menschen machen. Und um einen neuen Menschen machen zu können, müssen wir neue Situationen kreieren, neue Situationen im realen Leben, nicht im surrealen draußen in der Stadt. Und so haben sie angefangen, solche Aktionen zu planen und durchzuführen in Paris. Sie haben sich als Verkehrspolizisten verkleidet, auf eine Kreuzung am Boulevard Saint-Germain gestellt und die Autos immer im Kreis fahren lassen, um den Leerlauf des Konsums zu zeichnen. Und Guy Debord, ihr Anführer, hat an eine Mauer eines der ersten Graffiti geschrieben, ne travaillez jamais, arbeitet nie, non lavorate mai. Dann sind sie 3 Tage lang in die Vorstädte, in die Banlieues von Paris gegangen und haben sich dort diesen Betonbauten ausgesetzt, diesen furchtbaren Sozialbauten und seien am Schluss nur noch rumgekrochen auf dem Boden, wobei sie zugeben musste, das lag vielleicht auch an den paar Flaschen Mezcal, die sie mitgenommen haben für diesen 3-tägigen Ausflug. Sie haben also die psychischen Schwellen der Stadt, die psychogeografischen Drehscheiben exploriert, Sie haben sie aufgezeichnet auf Karten. Sie haben eine Studentin ein Jahr lang sozusagen beobachtet, wie sie immer zu ihrem Klavierlehrer ging, in die Kantine, nach Hause, zum Klavierlehrer, in die Kantine, nach Hause. Und sie sagen, das ist ein furchtbares Gefängnis, diese Geometrie, dieses Dreieck, in dem solche Leute leben. Wir müssen sie aus diesen geometrischen Strukturen hinausreißen in andere Strukturen, in andere Städte. Und sie träumten davon, ein New Babylon in Europa zu bauen, Städte, in denen es Quartiere gibt, die so langweilig und öde sind, dass man gar nicht anders kann, als zu arbeiten. Oder andere ganz verspielte Quartiere, wo man nicht anders kann, als zu flippern und andere Spiele zu betreiben. Oder Quartiere, wo es unglaublich interessant riecht, sinnlich riecht und Musik zu hören ist, schöne, hallende Räume und wo man gar nicht anders kann, als sich gegenseitig zu küssen. Und sie träumten davon, dass man auch andere Häuser bauen muss, Häuser auf Schienen. Und wenn man am Abend in Paris einschläft, erwacht man am Morgen vielleicht an einem Strand in der Bretagne oder irgendwo in den Bergen vor einem Gletscher und ist einer neuen Situation ausgesetzt. Sie wollten auch die Abfahrtszeiten an den Bahnhöfen und die Schaltzentralen, so mit den Angaben, wo die Züge hingehen, manipulieren, dass jemand, der, sagen wir, in Zürich einsteigt und in Badenbruck aussteigen will, plötzlich in Locarno landet, da aussteigt und sagt, der Espresso ist ja viel besser, ich glaube, ich beginne hier am Lago Maggiore irgendwie ein neues Leben, weit weg von meiner Familie, von dem allem träumen wir auch immer wieder. Wie könnte man ein neues Leben beginnen, ein anderes Leben? Das war die Aufgabe, die Situationisten sich stellten, mit Aktionen wollten sie die Menschen eben dazu bringen, die eigene Stadt zu erkunden, die eigene Seele. Sie gingen auch spazieren, zum Beispiel in Deutschland im Harz, aber mit einer Karte der Londoner U-Bahn-Linien. Und so erlebt man natürlich manche Überraschungen und eine Überraschung war auch, wie gut es geklappt hat, als sie die Studenten in Paris aufwiegelten und sie waren in der Tat die Anführer des Okkupationskomitees in der Sorbonne und sie haben eben auch all diese Sprüche, die Fantasie an die Macht, unter dem Pflaster der Strand sozusagen erfunden und eben in Paris hinausgetragen und träumten vom großen Generalstreik, vom Zusammenbruch aller Strukturen und von einem neuen Leben in einer neuen Welt. Nun, 1968 war genau diese Zeit der Gegenkultur und da komme ich zu unserem Gast, Erik Davis, der hier bei uns ist. Ich habe ihn heute getroffen und gedacht, das kann ja gar nicht sein. Erik Davis muss doch viel älter sein, denn er schreibt über die 70er Jahre zum Beispiel in seinem Buch High Weirdness so unglaublich anschaulich, dass man denkt, er muss dabei gewesen sein. Eines seiner letzten Bücher habe ich hier, Blotter, das sind so LSD-Zettelchen mit Kunst drauf, die er analysiert, die er auch in den Kontext der Zeit stellt. Und das Buch ist wahnsinnig toll zum Lesen. Ich glaube, man sollte es nicht essen. Vielleicht hat es irgendwo ein bisschen LSD auf diesen Seiten drin. Und dann ist es auch nicht mehr so gut. Erik Davis wird sich mit Stefano Knuchel unterhalten über ganz viele aktuelle Fragen, die er schon in einem Buch, das vor 25 Jahren erschienen und noch immer nicht auf Deutsch übersetzt ist, behandelt hat. Das sind Fragen, die eben um die Zusammenhänge von Maschinen, Denken, Roboter, Mensch, wo sind die Grenzen, wie fließend sind diese Grenzen sich drehen. Stefano Knuchel wird das noch genauer erklären. Aber das Buch heißt Techgnosis. Da sind zwei Wörter drin, die Technik und die Gnosis. Die Technik, wie wir alle wissen, ist sozusagen das Beispiel eben für die abendländische, instrumentelle, technische, kalkulierende Vernunft. Die Gnosis ist eine antike religiöse Strömung, eine meistens unterdrückte Strömung, die immer wieder hervortaucht, die eben vielleicht auch in der Adoration des Computers wieder aufgetaucht ist. Das werden wir nachher genauer hören. Und diese Techgnosis, diese Verbindung ist besonders interessant, weil ja in der Aufklärung Descartes, die französische Philosophie, den Menschen so ein bisschen schizophren eingeteilt haben in Leib und Seele, irgendwie verbunden mit der Zwirbeldrüse. Und sie haben eben gesagt, der Mensch als herrliches Subjekt muss sich die Natur untertan machen. Die Natur ist nur ein Objekt. Und wir Menschen sind die Subjekte und herrschen über sie. Aber man hat damals nicht gemerkt, dass der Mensch damit sich selber eben auch der Vernunft unterwirft. Er ist ein Subjektum, er ist der eigenen Vernunft unterworfen. Er hat sich selber in die Fesseln des Kalküls, des Geldes, des Mehrwerts, des Kapitals geschlagen und immer wieder träumt er danach, sich daraus zu befreien. Er träumt davon, nicht mehr Subjekt und Objekt gegenüberzustellen, sondern ein Jekt zu werden, ein Wurf, ein Würfelwurf, alea jacta est, ein Fluss, ein Strom, ein Bewusstseinsstrom. Und da kamen dann eben alle diese Dichter, Künstler, auch die Erotomanen natürlich und das LSD und all diese Sachen, die unser Bewusstsein in den Fluss bringen, ins Spiel. Und darüber schreibt Erik Davis eben so anschaulich, dass man denkt, naja, er war ja da wohl schon irgendwie dabei, noch sozusagen bevor er geboren wurde. Das ist ja sozusagen seine eigene Wiedergeburt in dieser Zeit. Und es ist eben auch ein Buch über die Literatur in einer gewissen Weise, denn er beschreibt Hermes, den Gott der Schrift, ganz am Anfang des Buches, als zentrale Figur für unser Denken. Denn auch das Schreiben ist eine Techgnosis. Die Phönizier haben ja nach Griechenland das Alphabet gebracht, nur 26 Buchstaben, nicht mehr 500, 700 oder 1000 Zeichen wie bei den alten Ägyptern, so eine komplizierte Schrift, die nur ein paar wenige konnten, sondern eine Schrift, mit der man Handel betreiben kann, über alle Schutzzölle und Schutzwälle von Trump hinaus, klare Befehle geben mit 26 Buchstaben, Verträge schreiben, die nicht missverständlich sind, Verträge eben, in denen sogar die Vokale zum ersten Mal niedergeschrieben werden konnten. Das ist eine technische Schrift, die Schrift für Befehle, Verträge, Abmachungen, Handel, Geld. Die Autoren aber haben immer schon damals im alten Griechenland, in der Romantik, bei den Surrealisten und bis heute immer dafür gekämpft, dass man die Schrift aus dieser Zwangsfessel befreit. Sie haben das gnostische Element der Schrift, das Unerklärbare an der Sprache, den Klang der Sprache, die Sinnlichkeit der Sprache, die sich dem Sinn entzieht, immer wieder auf ihre eigenen Weisen, in ihren eigenen Rhythmen, in ihren eigenen Sprachlandschaften aufgeschrieben. Und das werden wir in den nächsten Tagen hören. Wir werden das hören bei Judith Schalansky im Gespräch mit Jutta Persson. Judith Schalansky, die diese Reihe über Naturkunden bei Mattes und Seitz, 100 Bücher über alle möglichen Phänomene der Natur, jedes Buch ein eigenes Kunstwerk herausgegeben hat. Wir werden es bei Irene Solà hören, die auf Katalanisch lesen wird. Bei ihr spricht die Natur, die Pilze sprechen miteinander, schwesterlich verschwistert und verliebt und die Blitze sprechen aus dem Himmel, ein Todesurteil und die Wolken sprechen, die ganze Natur spricht. Wir werden es bei Marindiai hören am Schluss dieser Tage, natürlich auch beim transgotthardischen Dialog zwischen Peter Weber, dem wunderbaren Sprachmagier aus Zürich, im Dialog mit Matteo Terzaghi. Wir werden es bei Scholastik Mukasonga hören, die uns aus der Quellbereich des Nils berichten wird. Und wir werden es eben auch von Fleur Jecki hören in den Lesungen. Wir werden in die Musik eintauchen, in die musikalischen Welten, in den Tanz, in all diese verschiedenen Formen, wo der Mensch eben sich aus den Fesseln seines engen Anzuges und den Schuhen befreien will und so in einen Fluss geraten, in einen freien Fluss, in einen freien Bewusstseinsstrom, in den ich jetzt aber nicht gerate, denn ich überlasse jetzt dieses strömende Reden, den Überfluss an Ideen, den Überfluss an Wissen, den Überfluss an Kreativität, einem kreativeren Geist, nämlich Erik Davis, im Gespräch mit Stefano Knuchel. Vielen Dank.
Buonasera. Sono diversi anni che puntiamo Erik Davis per averlo e quando finalmente ci ha detto di sì eravamo felicissimi. E poi subito dopo ci siamo detti, ok, e adesso come lo presentiamo al grande pubblico? Perché il nome non è noto, ma il mondo che ci porta è affascinante, è ricco, è estremamente attuale, però è un po' un labirinto. E contrariamente a quello che si pensa, la difficoltà nel labirinto non è quella di uscire, ma è proprio quello di trovare un punto d'entrata. Poi una volta che uno è entrato nel labirinto, che è così meraviglioso, perché uno vorrebbe uscire? Come diceva il poeta americano Charles Simic, che è scomparso pochi anni fa, aveva intitolato una raccolta di poesie "Il mostro ama il suo labirinto". Ecco, noi vogliamo entrare in questo labirinto, ma come entrare? Ci siamo detti che forse il modo migliore è quello di sollecitare, chiamare il mostro verso di noi in modo che ci indichi l'entrata. Per questo, per iniziare il nostro dialogo con Erik Davis, l'idea è proprio quella di lasciargli la parola per 15 minuti. Quindi chiamo sul palco, spero che venga il mostro ad accoglierci, Erik Davis. Erik Davis!
Thank you. I guess I feel like I should go rah or some kind of monster face, but it's wonderful to be here. I'm so happy and so grateful to Raphael, Stefano, and everyone that I've met so far to bring me here. And it's not just because it's a cool festival and I get to meet new people and that's a lot of fun, but because I've wanted to come to Ascona for a very long time, and I'll explain a little bit about why in my talk. But it's just just even being here for a day, the ability to go up and walk around Monte Verità and to think about the people who have come through here and all the things that happened here. To think about Hermann Hesse and Isadora Duncan and Hugo Ball and D.H. Lawrence and of course Carl Jung. And then just in the very same day, I get to waltz down, 15 minutes away, and there I am at Eranos with, again, an extraordinary collection of characters that have been very important in my life. Of course, Materialidad and Jung and Henri Corbin, and it goes on and on. Richard Wilhelm, I read the I Ching when I was a young man. All of this stuff is very powerful to me. In fact, I got a PhD in religious studies, and my advisor was the student of Wendy Doniger, who was a student of Eliade. So it's really like part of the current that I inhabit. And then I like to think about, well, what has changed? I knew all that stuff 2 days ago, when I was flying here. But now I have a very different sense of it because I've been here. I've been located in the space, even for a very brief period of time. And I'm very glad that Stefan offered an excellent summary of psychogeography, so I don't have to kind of go into it. It has many wonderful dimensions, and it's kind of an open term. But one way of thinking about it is why is it that certain places develop extraordinary cultural expressions associated with them? What is it? Is it just happenstance? Is it just that a few people happened to come here and then they knew other people and that happened? Or is there something deeper, stranger, more multidimensional about why things happen? Does it involve nature? Nature as another agent, as a character with whom we're interacting and who might have something to say about what happens in certain places where certain mountains meet certain waters. And I've thought a lot about psychogeography because I've written a lot about my home state of California in the United States. I'm one of the relatively rare Californians who was born in California. And even more than that, my family goes back to the origins of the state, which is very rare. So I have a fifth generation Californian. And I've always been fascinated with the place, both its physical topography, but also the extraordinary cultural richness and technological creativity and bizarre cultural idiocy and unfortunate cults and right-wingers and left-wingers. I mean, it's just a fascinating story. If you look at America as a whole, so much has come out of California, particularly in the religious, spiritual, and technological domains, which are of my main interests. And I wrote a book came out almost 20 years ago called The Visionary State. And what it did was to try to tell the story of the extraordinary range of religious invention, of cults, of gurus, of new forms of spirituality, of old traditions reconvened. And it told it through a description of the architecture and the landscape of California. So it was really a psychogeographical project trying to answer the question, why did all this stuff happen here? Yes, there is historical reasons. Yes, there are cultural reasons. But there's something about the place, or maybe there's something about the place to think, psychogeographically. How is it the case that San Francisco, such an important site of incredible subcultural activity and political richness, admittedly has changed drastically, but how much of it has to do with the extraordinary number of hills, with the proximity to the bay, with the way the fog rolls in the summer and cools people unexpectedly when they think they're going to get the sun. Another example that's very close here is the Esalen Institute. Probably some of you have heard about it. It features in Mad Men at the end of the series. And it was is a center for psychospirituality, for new forms of humanistic psychology or human potential. Very, very influential place from the early 1960s on. Very much the Monte Verita of California, and still has some of that energy with it. But today, when I was down at Eranos, I was like, oh, this is kind of familiar, because if you ever have the opportunity to go to Esalen, it's a beautiful place. And where is it? It's on the edge of a cliff. Behind it is very, very steep mountains. And these mountains go under the water, so it becomes very deep. You don't see it, but of course it gets very deep into the Pacific Ocean. And yes, it's an ocean, it's not a lake, but there was a very nice kind of resonance there. And how much of the quality of Esalen has to do with this particular place, not just the mountains and the ocean, but the fact that there are hot springs there, and that the hot springs are very much part of the culture of the place. How do people use them? Becoming nude, talking with each other in the nude, enjoying the waters, incredibly delicious hot springs, which of course were very important to the Native Americans who still live in the area, but were once the folks in the place, the Esalen, which is the place is named after. And the way in which the continuities of the landscape shape the kind of culture that emerges. But thinking about California, I also sort of take that geological, psychogeographic approach a little bit larger. Like, again, why does this stuff happen here? Well, the reason there's a hot spring there, and the reason there's so many hot springs in California, is, of course, it sits on the San Andreas Fault, which is the largest fault line in the world. And it's the fault line and the tensions in this fault line that bisect the state from north to south that leads to all the earthquakes. The earthquake that destroyed San Francisco in 1906, the earthquakes that have come up and that will come up soon, because we're due in many places in the state. We're really due for an earthquake. Well, what does it mean to create a culture at the edge of a continent that's shaking all the time, that's just about to break, that's under in tremendous tension? Does that have a relationship? Could that possibly influence it? I'm not sure, but I like the idea. I like the poetry of it. It tells us something deeper, I think, that's important to tune into psychogeographically. And one more point to think about is that this fault line is not only going north and south along the west side of the North American continent. It actually loops around through Alaska and goes down into Japan, and this is called the Ring of Fire. So we have this fault line or set of faults that are moving, magma, in tension, the earth grinding on itself, exploding at certain hot points, shaking the earth. It's where east meets west, right? And so suddenly the sort of psycho-spiritual destiny of California starts to make a little bit more sense. It's kind of an interesting story, because in some ways you can look at, and or there's a strong myth that California is kind of the end of the West. This is very much a myth, if you want to think about it, but a kind of dominant narrative, at least in American history, where we come, we move, there's expansion, there's the frontier is moved through, and then boom, you slam into the Pacific. Well, then what? Then where do you go? What's happening here? And yes, this is just one way of looking at things. There are people moving everywhere in every direction all the time. American history is not the only history in the world. But there's still something poetic and I think deeply meaningful about the case of California as sort of holding this kind of arc of an ending and a question of what next. Where does the frontier go? And in this sense, you start to look at the extraordinary technological development associated with California and the extraordinary psychospiritual development associated with California. And you go, oh, well, these are two different frontiers. They're inner frontiers, or they're frontiers of technology, or they're frontiers of space. We also had an extremely important aerospace industry. And some of the most powerful telescopes in the late 19th century and the early 20th century were in California. Edwin Hubble's discovery that we don't just live in one galaxy, but are actually in a universe with myriad galaxies, happened in California. So there's an interesting way that you can look at the history of this whole rich place through a psychogeographical lens that's very important. I'm thinking of a poem by a Zen beatnik named Lew Welch, not very well known, but an important California poet. And he has a poem called The Song That Mount Tamalpais Sings. And if you've ever been to the Bay Area, someone might have pointed out Mount Tam or Mount Tamalpais to you. It's the largest mountain in the county north of San Francisco. So if you go from San Francisco over the Golden Gate Bridge, you will see Mount Tam. And it's interesting when you move there, people often point out and they say, oh yeah, see, you can see the outline of an Indian maiden sleeping. And there's this kind of figure in the mountain. You know, I'm sure there are mountains around here where people have names for certain figures in the mountain. It's like a way of kind of remembering our animist life where stones have life and personality and character. It's probably just a myth, probably doesn't go back to the Native Americans, but it's an interesting point. So his poem has a refrain in it, which is, this is the last place, there's nowhere else to go. And it's a strange line because it's at once sort of resolved and kind of anxious, not sure about what's going on. And I think it really points out something very profound, a profound restlessness, rootlessness, creative urge that has to do with California. And this has been a lot of the subject of my own work. Stefan mentioned that I've done a lot of work on the history of counterculture, very important thing to me. And again, one of these questions, where does it come from? Thinking about the hippies of the 1960s with the long hair and the sort of earthiness and natural foods and nudity and worship of ancient gods. And where does that come from? It doesn't really come from the beatniks. The beatniks were kind of urban, cigarette smoking, wearing black, listening to jazz. It's like, where do these guys come from? So you start doing history, right? That's what history's fun for. Find the ancestors. Where does this come from? And I already knew about the Nature Boys, which was a small group of people in the 1940s who looked like hippies, long hair. They ate raw food. They were totally into vegetarianism. They walked everywhere. And, of course, we think of Nature Boys and, we think of, not to mention, except it's California, so they're not mentioned, they're Kinder. But, they sort of represent some of this current. And then I remember coming across a photograph of this fellow. He was out in Palm Springs in the desert, and he's sitting there with blue overalls, jean overalls. He's got a big bushy beard. He's barefoot, and he's holding an acoustic guitar against a very humble backdrop. And I'm like, oh, what is this from? 1971, maybe 1968? And it's 1918. And this guy's name is Bill Pester, and he was a German national. And so then I was like, okay. And this current of research, of course, led me back to Mount Veritas, where all of this, the elements of hippie life, or so many of the elements of hippie life, were invented, rediscovered, learned from the land, learned from the sun. It's hard to say what. So part of my enjoyment in being here is a kind of affirmation of the way in which landscape shapes culture and culture shapes landscape, and that psychogeography is actually is a way of moving through the world that allows it to have more resonance and more meaning necessarily than we often feel. Because even though I've thoroughly enjoyed, even in the few hours I've been here, the sense of location, the sense of place, the invocation of the traces and currents of previous lives and of previous cultural experiments just by being here, of course, how did I actually get here? Did I walk over across the Alps to get here? No, I got on a plane in San Francisco. I had a hellish connection in Heathrow. There's security theater everywhere. I land at an airport. I get in a car. I'm on my phone connecting with everybody. I'm in traffic just like I am at home. I'm driving down a freeway that's just like my freeways at home. We cross the border and I look up and there's a casino called Old Wild West. And I'm like, wait, I'm from the Old Wild West. What? And there's this kind of placelessness in our contemporary experience that's extraordinary. And psychogeography allowing, just even for a moment, just for a story, just for an imaginative play, but allowing the possibility that the land and the non-human creatures in the land might have something to say, might be carrying stories, might be carrying energies or forces that influence, that shape our experience of the world, our experience of being human, is a way of countering the placelessness that we are so brought into, not just in terms of the way that capitalism has rendered a kind of homogeneity to our urban or human cultural experience, but also the ways that the phones suck us into a no place that we all share. We go around the world and everybody's got the phone, and if you handed them the phone, you might not know the language, but you kind of know how to get around it, right? That's all it's like a mode of implosion. That's what Jean Baudrillard would call it. And there's something interesting that you'll notice if you buy Apple products, your new iPhone or an Apple Air or whatever, is that if you read the little fine print, it'll say designed in California. Why? Because Apple emerges from both of these creative streams, not just the technological innovation that has been associated with California, but also the spiritual and consciousness exploration. Steve Jobs famously went to India. He was a vegetarian. He belonged to Monte Verita. He, had a guru. He took LSD. He liked the Whole Earth Catalog. He was kind of a post-hippie. He studied Zen Buddhism. And how these things fit together and the contradictions, enormous contradictions, is a lot of what my work is about. And I write both as a Californian and as a kind of cultural historian. So in some sense, I kind of want to just apologize. Like, California's been a cool place, but it's let loose something that we really can't stop. And of course, other countries, other places have been largely contributing to that field, but the particular energy of technological culture in the sense of the iPhone and the sense of the internet, the first node of the internet went from the Bay Area down to Los Angeles. So it's like cool stuff, but sorry. and so navigating that tension is really what I'm most interested in. Is the fascination with and the excitement about the new worlds opening up, but also the profound need to ground, not just in the physical landscape, but in the sort of mind of psychogeography and in the sense of essence and soul that Carl Jung really helped us kind of open up. So I think with that, I'll thank you, and I look forward to my conversation with Stefano.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you for welcoming us in your labyrinth. So, yes, we could go in many directions, in many ways, but maybe I'll just propose you that we make a little time travel. So we are on the 10th of April, 2025. In 40 minutes, we need to go back here. But now, I'd like to go somewhere else, back in time. And in the process of getting back here is maybe understanding better how we got here. Because that's also one of the precious things about your books. They really explain us and they really show how certain things happen that explain a little bit more what we have under our eyes, but maybe we don't see. So first stop, I would say, we go back to the 70s. And so this will be related to your book, High Weirdness. I would say the 70s, the moment in which cracks in reality starts to appear.
Yeah. I think I'm drawn to the 1970s, partly because I was a very young person, and my first impression of the cultural world was the early 70s. So I've always been very fond of it. And I kept thinking about it. What's going on there? There's something going on there. And I came to see that actually it plays a really significant role, and there's a couple of things to say about it. One is that it's the era when the experiments associated with the counterculture, new ways of living, drugs, new religious movements, political fervency, feminism, ecology, when they kind of left the centers of student culture in the 60s and they kind of spread everywhere. So it becomes the place when that opens up a new kind of world. And I can't speak for Europe, but in the United States, it led to a much more strong sense of pluralism, where people have their different ways of living their lives. And capitalism learned that it could start to feed back. Oh, you want to live your life this way? Here's some books you might want to read. Oh, you want to live this way? Here's some tools that you might want to use. And indeed, when you look at the history of the economy, that some very significant things happened in the early 1970s. And again, I'm speaking from what I know, which is mostly America, but it's obviously related. One is that we went into a more consumer credit situation. So consumers were encouraged to take on credit in order to buy the things that are going to manifest their lifestyles. So we begin to shift about where the engines are coming from. The dollar gets disconnected from the gold standard, which allows it to float free and essentially invites all the forces of financialization that we suffer under and have suffered under for the last 50 years into the room. Like, go ahead, play your games. We don't have the gold standard anymore. Go at it, kids. And at the same time, of course, there's really significant technological developments. Both the rise of surveillance, the spread of digital technology. We're not quite at the level of the personal computer yet, but we're pretty much at the point of when the personal computer starts hitting. So all of these elements are crossing in a way that makes things very peculiar. And what I do in High Weirdness is that I take some very fringe characters, a science fiction writer who may be mad, and two gentlemen who take a lot of drugs, but all of whom are excellent writers and who wrote about their extraordinary experiences. And these experiences are hard to name. It's not just a drug trip, it's not a religious experience, it's not a science fiction story, it's not psychosis, it's not political satire, it's not a Zen joke, but it's kind of all of those things. And my belief is that by looking in the margins and looking at these extreme narratives that are well written and full of information by very intelligent people, it's kind of like prophecy. It's like unintentional prophecy, where by reading those patterns, you can understand more what's happening on a deep level in the culture than by looking at more mainstream figures. And what I see and what I saw there are, in a way, it's a setup for where we are now. Like, if you look at what's peculiar about the internet, if you look at the rise of conspiracy theory, if you look at the popularity of thinking about UFOs, if you look about the return of right-wing fascist ideology, if you look at the kind of way that sort of Christianity has expressed itself in the 21st century, at least in some forms, a lot of the popularity of science fiction, of superheroes, nerd culture, a lot of that stuff can be tracked back to the kinds of ways that these cultural transformations occurred in the 1970s. And so in many ways, I kind of look at okay, we got something going. It could have gone different ways. We could be in a better world than we are. It's not that it was necessarily this way, but a lot of the contemporary sense of crisis has its roots, and it's valuable to go and look at those half psychotic, half marginal, half psychedelic weirdness things in order to get a better sense of just why things are peculiar the way they are today. And that's really driven a lot of my work, is this kind of finding prophetic signs in marginal places as a way to understand where we are, particularly through the lens of religion and the sacred.
But it's interesting because in the 70s, through the three characters you choose, you feel weirdness start creeping into reality. But these three persons, Terence McKenna, Robert Elton Wilson, Philip K. Dick, they feel it maybe before everyone else. That's also part of the fringe counterculture, like you burn yourself, but that doesn't go mainstream. But what's interesting is also these three characters, I think they have three complete different reactions to this kind of weird creeping in.
Absolutely. It's not a one response situation. I would say that Philip K. Dick had remained a religious seeker, that he felt there was some truth to be had, and that even though reality increasingly looked like a series of simulations, perhaps manipulated by dark forces and with no way out to get back to something normal, that he still held out a kind of faith in metaphysics, in some ability to understand the world and to encounter like a true reality, coupled with a lot of humor. That's one thing where they're all very similar. They're all funny. And it's really important to say that, like this whole current I'm talking about is also very funny, and I try to, in my writing, be reasonably funny and still say stuff, but it's very intentional because it's, I think, a key element in keeping your sanity and a key element in affirming human characteristics, particularly at a time of such dizzying change and confusion. So they all share that part. But in other ways, yeah, they take it in different directions. And they also, especially Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna, they both remained skeptics in a way, even as they plunged into very strange possibilities. And for me, this is also a very important model in the sense of when you're navigating a weird situation where none of us can really see the whole totality. We don't know how to think about AI. We don't know how to think about this particular conspiracy theory, even though it seems like it makes a lot of sense. But how do we judge? Where's truth? We're in a very difficult situation, is that a balance of skepticism and a willingness to dive into how strange things really are, not to put your head in the sand, but to look at it, wrestle with it, but at the same time keep a kind of critical distance, a certain sense of discernment that also has to do with humor. And there are models for that. They weren't perfect models. They also fell. They also made mistakes. They got paranoid. They had dumb ideas that they believed were too strong. So they're not perfect models. But they tell us something, I think, about how to navigate a situation where things are becoming increasingly untethered.
There is one very touching moment. It's when Philip K. Dick in 1977 goes to France and makes a conference, and everyone thinks he's gone completely crazy, completely bonkers. By the way, I just underlined the fact that this morning I got this news that in England they would use data to try to know beforehand if someone can turn into a murderer.
Yeah.
So Minority Report, that was written by Philip K. Dick in 1956, so 70 years ago, tells exactly that. It's also been a very important movie by Steven Spielberg. Now, that is to say that he foresaw something. And when he goes in France, and everybody wants him to speak about science fiction, tell us more, come on, entertain us, he tries to convey its own truth and its own also, maybe that is lost also a little bit in relation to the reality. I think it's a very important, key and touching moment.
Yeah, I agree. That is a very touching moment. And he was really wrestling towards the end of his life with what to do about his experience. I mean, he was a bit of a fabricator, so we never know exactly what happened to him. And he didn't really know. But it seemed like some extraordinary religious metaphysical experience, a series of experiences happened to him that really transformed him. And it left him, though, with a puzzle. We'd like to believe that if we had some extraordinary experience of metaphysical reality, well, then we'll know and we can be relieved from our existential questioning. But in some ways, it can make it worse. You just don't know. And so he doesn't know. He's the great not knower. And so he's trying to navigate that point when he shows up there and disappoints everyone, and everyone thinks he's quite crazy. But if you read that script, and particularly an essay that he wrote shortly after that, whose title I'm just gonna I'm gonna garble if I try to say it. It's like you read it now and you're like, okay, I can kind of see this is how someone responds when they feel they're in a world of simulacra, when they're in a world of simulation. The world that we're just about to go into, where we really can't trust video truth anymore, where the powers of AI to simulate any kind of verbal, visual thing is so extraordinary that it will scramble our sense of how to locate, our already scrambled sense of how we orient through reality. And from that perspective, looking at reading what he's talking about, you're like, okay, I see what he's kind of, referring to. So I felt like Philip K. Dick is not the kind of author who, it's not like he foresaw the internet or foresaw social media or foresaw the iPhone, or he's not that kind of prophet. It's more that while he did call a number of technologies more than most science fiction writers, it's more that he articulated the way it feels to be sort of afflicted and inspired and shaped by the technologies of our moment. Like there's one in the simulacra, there are these little advertising insects. They're like little mechanical insects, and they come around and they bother you all the time and telling you about the latest deals and how you have to swat them and like get them out of the car. And so obviously that's an absurd, satirical, Dada kind of thing. We were not actually going to have those, but it's exactly what it feels like, trying to navigate all these ads coming at you when you're just trying to talk to your wife, and it's insane. So he's very good at kind of predicting that, the kind of emotional life and the ambiguity and the sense of not knowing in the midst of all of these changes.
I also think that somehow it could be very actual. Talking about spirituality and rituals, maybe the idea of someone coming in front of you and saying, I'm sorry, I don't know anymore what's real and what is not real, should be something like an act that every one of us should do now. Get in front of an audience and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what's real and not real anymore. So in that sense, I feel it was really touching and really connected to what is our reality now.
Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful way of putting it, a certain kind of, to use fancy words, epistemological humility, and that I think we all sort of have to go through that and be able to say that and be able to recognize that if we're going to then be able to navigate through it. Because otherwise what you're doing is you're holding on to a story, or you're putting yourself up as an authority, because most people know they don't know, and then the people who say they know, well, they're very satisfying for a lot of those people. And indeed, that's kind of a political reality. In the United States, it's very in our face now, right? The one who knows. And we can see the hollowness in that, like it's a zombie, it's like a robot of some kind of characters from mafia movies and a certain sort of salesman type. And yet it works really well, this like creaky, empty robot, because it knows. And that's so valuable to people because they're confused. So I think embracing confusion and playing with the ambiguity, and we have no choice really if we're going to stay awake.
Yeah, and Robert Anthony Wilson really managed to anticipate this idea that anyway, nothing is to be believed, so play with it, overplay the nonsense of it. So in that sense also it's a very interesting character.
Yeah, he is a very interesting character, and when you hear that kind of approach, there's always the ethical problem. Well, what about ethics? Like, then doesn't that just give you an excuse to do whatever you want? And Wilson himself was a very ethical person, although he never really grounded it. He didn't explain, I'm ethical because of this, or because I was raised a Catholic, or because I have sympathy for the poor, or what he doesn't really lay it on the ground, because it is a problem. That's the problem with that sort of, it's all a story that we're inhabiting, it's all a fiction, is that how does that get constrained? And indeed, one of the kind of disturbing things about writing High Weirdness is that when I wrote the story about Robert Anton Wilson in the 1960s and 1970s, he's part of a kind of a very small movement of people who are approaching politics as a kind of prank. So it's like, how do we prank people? How do we creatively lie and mess with people's heads as a way of liberating, as a way of breaking down narratives we don't agree with, oppressive narratives, and liberating it to something joyous. My book comes out in 2018, and I'm like, I start to talk about it, and I thought I would spend most of my time talking about Philip K. Dick, but I spent most of my time talking about Robert Anton Wilson because everybody recognized that the methods he talks about had been brought in by the alt-right and that were part of the first Trump campaign was the use of pranks, of aggressive satire, of a lot of the kind of anarchistic Dada elements that had previously been associated with more left-wing anarchism had been appropriated by the right, and indeed the right, in America anyway, became the counterculture. They took that energy, including energy that I could see, and so it was like, oh my God. And a lot of that has to do with conspiracy as well, and how conspiracy can attract people, how it becomes an alternative narrative that's very mythic, it has religious elements, but it can also be used to obfuscate what's going on. So the role of conspiracy thinking and the fact that it is now such an important part of our world, it's always been there. In some countries, there have been conspiracies, major conspiracies for a very long time. But in the West, it's really changed significantly in the last 10, 15 years, partly because it's part of the weirdness. It's like part of the sign that you're going into this weirdness space. The conspiracies make more sense. They have more power. They're more attractive.
I left Terence McKenna as the last one because maybe it can help us make the transition between this first moment, the 70s, in which certain persons feel this crack in reality and start kind of giving it a shape or a perception. And McKenna is there, but is also there in the next stop, which is the 1990s.
Yeah.
That's where that crack in the reality becomes the bread for every day and for everyone. And but Terence McKenna is super enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. Terence, he's a very complicated character, very interesting, very entertaining. If you've never seen him speak, it's worthwhile if this at all interests you. And yeah, he maintained an extreme exuberance for the far out sides of psychedelic experience, but he approached it almost like a kind of naturalist. He wasn't really a spiritual person. He wasn't seeking God. He wasn't interested in metaphysical realities. He kind of believed that the farthest edges of psychedelic experience revealed something about reality, about the way the world actually worked, including a lot of the bizarre features of it. And so he kind of came back as a kind of, again, funny, stand-up, prophet, speculator about these realities. And he was also very interested in technology. He was not an anti-technology hippie. He really was fascinated by media, by computers. He believed in the kind of evolution of new technologies. He thought that we would create new technologies that would have some of the powers of the things that we have or shortly will have. So he was always very interested in that sense of progress, which also is what gave his work such resonance later in his life. So he doesn't really become well known until the 1990s when he's kind of like a circuit speaker. He goes out and he talks to kids at raves, and he talks to conferences of people who want to legalize MDMA, which was a completely crazy idea in the 1990s, but of course is now part of our world as well, where in the United States, the Defense Department is saying, yeah, we should really be using MDMA to heal PTSD in the soldiers. And, again, even from the 90s, that's just insane that we've come so far. So he entered into the 1990s culture, which my first book, Technosis, really comes out of, even though it has a much longer historical arc that goes back to the origins of writing. And covers a lot of territory, but it was written in the spirit of the 1990s that was really like my decade. Stefan mentioned he thought I would be older, but I'm very much not a boomer, but a Gen X person who kind of grew up, and the 1990s was kind of my decade. And it was an extraordinary time where new technologies were clearly going to change things. And as they cracked open, as people got onto the internet and went, okay, this is a different game, but it wasn't very well defined. It wasn't really well described. So it became a place where people could imagine and project and fantasize about different worlds, many of which were really quite utopian, or at least fun. A great example is that there was a huge amount of writing about virtual reality in the early 1990s, when the actual technology was extremely clunky. You'd put on these really heavy goggles, and it was terribly huge pixels. It was not immersive. It was only an idea, a technical idea. But the discourse was extraordinary because people saw that there was a crack and that there was real possibility here. But because it hadn't been totally captured, there was a sense of utopian possibility as well, which is something that technosis is really about, is the way that when dramatically new technologies enter into culture, there's usually a space at the beginning where there's a huge explosion of utopian thinking. And it's not just hype, partly it's hype. It's also because people sense on a collective level that something new is here. And we can, in that space, dream. We can dream again. And so people dream en masse. And then those dreams become myths, then they become ad slogans, then they become ways of capturing by the usual forces. And so we wind up where we are. And so the 90s was a very interesting period of time when, again, like with the 70s, the way that drugs moved from little hippie enclaves to the broader culture, technology moves from these little enclaves of freaks and techno nerds into the broader culture. And some of that apocalyptic energy, some of that foreseeing energy becomes available for everyone. And really becomes kind of the beginning of the process that we're in now as the internet becomes a mass medium.
Yeah. What is interesting in what you're writing about, Technosis is really an incredible book. Some people say that it was prescient because it's so actual. It's just been republished in Italy, and it speaks of today, but it speaks so much of the 90s. And what people didn't see there, and probably people still don't acknowledge very much, is how spirituality, myth, symbolism sneaked into the digital world, and that was a very relevant point.
Yeah, absolutely. That was always what the origin of the book was. Every time I would come across an example of where a technology and some kind of religion or spirituality or myth clashed or crossed fields, crossed swords, I just collected it. And this might have been in subculture, it might have been from movies, maybe it was from the history of magic, any place that happened. And then it just started to grow, and I started to see these patterns and to put them into a kind of historical order. And so it's always been very clear to me that technology is partly about, human projection or human narrative, and that those narratives are, inevitably religious or spiritual. None of the words are quite right, or mythological, or magical, or enchanted. One of the older, now discredited ideas about the 20th century is that with the rise of secularism and the rise of technology, everything's just going to go secular. We're going to lose that stuff. It's going to be a disenchanted world. They talked a lot about the disenchantment thesis. And now we know that that's just totally not true. It never really became disenchanted. Even in Europe, where church attendance plummets, you have all this other stuff that happens in the corners and the margins. And if you know how to look for it, you find patterns and recurring and archetypes and spiritual yearnings, and they manifest in all sorts of ways, some creative, some crazy, some beautiful, and that technology is part of that, and it's not distinguished. And part of that is because I think it's a sort of universal issue, but it's also because of that story about California, because it is for a certain generation of the boomer generation, a lot of technological development is done by people who are experimenting with their lives and are open to new ideas, even if they're not following a guru. They know people who do. And so there's this sense of the experimentalism around lifestyle and the openness to different levels of reality, partly through drugs and partly through the discovery of meditation and yoga and other forms of kind of mild altered states production, and the ability to kind of recognize that consciousness is a broad fan, it's not a single beam. These are kind of the same people. And so there's a sort of space opened up for that kind of experience inside of the emerging technology culture in California, and sort of by that extension, beyond California. Like one of the most important bands of some of these early bulletin boards in the 1980s and early 1990s is the Grateful Dead. Grateful Dead is sort of with their technological relationships, and yet it's like this old hippie psychedelic band. Why that group? Well, because of the way that California operates. So that's also partly a kind of cultural history, why these things are there. But it doesn't stop with that. It really has to do, I believe, with the fact that new technologies, when they shake up and disturb existing cultural norms, ways of communicating, ways of modeling the self, when they shake it up and force it open, before they just capture us in what they want to do, there's this space of who are we? And that who are we is always going to have, for a lot of people, religious, spiritual, mystical overtones. They might go in one direction or the other. Some people might see, in fact, that's another thing that I did in Technosis that I was very happy about. Because if you take a step back, you're like, okay, you're writing a book in the late 1990s, which is the first internet boom, when people were saying all sorts of total bullshit about the future of technology and the new era of abundance that was just around the corner, and a lot of it was scams for rich people to make money off of IPOs. So it's a scammy time when everyone's super enthusiastic about technology. And then I come out with a book that's about spirituality and technology, and religion and technology, what kind of crap that could be, right? And the fact that people still read it, the young people read it and go, oh man, this is great, it's really relevant. I'm like, how did I do that? And unfortunately, one of the main reasons that it worked is that I was kind of pessimistic. Yeah. Even at the time, just because of my character. I see the light side, but I also very much see the dark side. And that's one of the strange things about the technology myth connection, is that it's both features. So in the 1990s, there was the idea, with the internet, we're going to build a global mind, a global brain. This is how we're going to, so people, utopia, this is how we create the noosphere. We're going to have one mind, and we'll all be one planetary consciousness, and we'll be able to overcome all of our conflicts, and this kind of spiritual thinking. But right next door to that, with the same technological framework, you can say, oh my God, that's the Antichrist. That's the Antichrist system. That's the satanic dystopian control system that we need to escape from. And they're looking at the same technological possibility, but from almost opposite mythological lenses. Mm-hmm. And where do we see this today? With AI. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot to say about AI. I don't know whether you can go on and on and on. But one thing to note from the beginning is that almost everybody who engages with it seriously is going, well, on the one hand, it could really do da-da-da. And on the other hand, we really could be going down the tubes. And this is the people who are making it will admit this. So there's this flickering ambiguity, fundamental ambiguity in the kinds of technologies that we're building now that inevitably raise these kinds of apocalyptic frameworks. Even if we're just trying to think about them very rationally and very clearly, we can't help but play on a mythic or religious field in the broad sense of religion.
Yes, actually, we are getting back to the 10th of April 2025. So the 70s, with this relation to weirdness, to paranoia, to the crack in reality, and the 90s with the technological revolution and everything that goes into it, from the utopian to the dark side emerging, doesn't the two books combined give like the perfect description of what's happening right now in America? That's what people are voting for. That's what they're prepared to vote for.
Yeah, no, I would say there's been a fundamental breakdown and exploitation of the breakdown of conventional forms of understanding reality, and that the features of the kind of Stefan used the analogy of liquid to, you have a subject here, object here. Okay, that's one way of doing it. What's in between is some kind of liquid proto-reality, and that liquid quality is exploited, and it becomes the kind of norm. So we're all sort of drowning in it. And again, the role of conspiracy, it just has to be completely underscored here. I think that here's a good historical example, which I've written a little bit about on my Substack, Burning Shore, is the QAnon. And QAnon was a global phenomenon, but of course it happened very intensely in the United States. And even for historians of conspiracy like me, who have been interested in conspiracy theory my whole life, it was sort of something new about it, something different. And one of the features that it had is that there's no center to it. It's not like it all boils down to one story. Yes, the idea of Pizzagate and that the wealthy Democrats were committing child abuse and doing satanic rituals, that's a very important part. But it spread and moved in all these different directions, and you could go into QAnon boards and talk about time travel, and you could talk about the Trilateral Commission, and it was sort of like a meta-conspiracy. And it wasn't about a particular narrative even, it was just creating a platform, essentially, to use technological language, where like all the stuff was invited, and there was a feeling of connection. Oh, you're one too. Oh, we'll support each other. We're all, we're all in it together. Where goes one, where goes all. And so, that helped shift the whole political landscape in a really extraordinary way, both literally and as a kind of symptom of other shifts that were happening in the control of media and the control of narrative, and so we're living in that radical fragmentation right now, and this is the monster that appeared.
Yeah, in your blog, which is absolutely incredible on Substack, your most recent blog post was about this great nightmare that you witnessed, which is you thought what happened in America now at least contained like a bomb, a time bomb that was ready to explode, like to tear it in two parts. But you saw, and you're seeing now, something that's much more terrible than that.
Yeah, sorry about that, but no, the hope is that part of the MAGA coalition is Christian nationalism. And just to make it clear, if you're not tracking American Christianity, and why would you? Christian nationalism is not your old school fundamentalism, not even the fundamentalism of the 1970s or 80s, where people want to make political change and they have their moral values, but they also kind of reject a lot of the institutions of the secular world. They don't want to take over Hollywood. They just want to control it. And part of Christian nationalism, besides just saying that America's a Christian nation and we should be following the Ten Commandments instead of the Constitution and that kind of stuff, is that there's an active desire to take over the institutions of power. So it's to take over the entertainment industry, to take over the universities, to take over business, and to enforce Christian values from that kind of perspective. So it's a fresh, very politicized, very aggressively power-focused kind of movement. And it's not the dominant one yet, but it is part of it, and it's very much part of MAGA. A lot of the individuals that Trump brought into his administration are such Christian nationalists. And then on the other hand, you have the transhumanists. You have Elon Musk. Very, very tangentially. He'll occasionally mention Christianity, but he wants to go to Mars. He's looking to plug your brain into a computer. He's a libertarian. He doesn't care about religion. He's a sci-fi nerd. He's taking drugs. He's like a Burning Man guy. He's taking ketamine. He's like he was at Burning Man the years that I was at Burning Man. I mean, it's kind of weird, but that's the world that we're in, where these inversions kind of happen. And so I'm like, how do these guys play ball? Like they're part of the coalition, but at some point, the basic tension between very moralistic Christianity, who rejects the idea of like, experimenting with new forms of life, and no, we're going to stick to what we know. How does that going to work with this kind of the transhuman spirit? And what I started to notice as I looked at it more and more, and the billionaire Peter Thiel plays a very important role in this, is the way in which Silicon Valley itself is kind of going Christian. And what you are seeing is the kind of development and embrace of a different potential within Christianity that's kind of always been there, which is basically a Christian transhumanism or a Christian accelerationism. This is the idea that, we have to transform, that the new technologies are manifestations of God's providence, and we have to intensify it in order to create the new Jerusalem, in order to create God's kingdom on earth. And so, once you see that kind of model, then it's like, that's a perfect ideology for transhumanism, because otherwise, what is it? Hedonism? People are just going to like mutate in different directions to have fun. What are we going to do with that? That's going to cause a lot of problems. Then we have the problem of nihilism. Oh God, that they don't believe in anything anymore. So you get cults like the Zizians, who are like vegan, terrorists, and they're killing people out of a completely bizarre, very tech kind of mind frame. Well, actually, Christianity is a really good one. Let's get rid of that. Let's have people like believe in these models as a way of constraining some of the disruptive and explosive forces associated with transhumanism. And so, who knows? But you can see lots of that already kind of developing. And it's kind of terrifying. I don't want to end there, though, man.
No, we're not. No, we're going to end on a positive note. But,
Good.
A little bit about AI entering our world.
Yeah.
Because, actually, AI promises incredible things, but it sneaks in on our core business, on our profound identity in writing. That's where it shows up right now. So that's a very interesting point. You wrote an incredible article in your blog about AI and writing, and you say that this alien appears in our language.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think anyone really predicted that. If even people who were thinking very, very hard about artificial intelligence 20 years ago, what were they thinking about? They were thinking about swarms of little robots, or they were thinking about, mastermind physicists or financial, operations or whatever. They weren't thinking that one of the main things that AI would do initially is to sort of undermine cultural production. Or transform it, or whatever you want to say, move in on the field of it, let alone language. And that's, we always have to remember that when we say AI now, we mostly mean large language models, and the word language is in the thing, that it really has to do with exploiting a certain capacity that's already in language, and discovering that, oh my, that works really, really well. So it's also something about language. And one of my arguments in Technosis is that we're already cyborgs, and we've been cyborgs for centuries, for millennia, because once you bond with writing, you have a kind of human, non-human system, and that it's very important to recognize the way that language and writing together are not entirely human artifacts, that in a way they have their own logic, their own non-human ways of being in the world. And this is something I learned very much from growing up in the era of deconstruction and post-structuralism. Not all, there's a lot of stuff you could say about it, and a lot of stuff we don't really need anymore, but one of the core things that I think is extremely important is that language is kind of an alien that we're attached to, that we are, but also kind of makes us, that we didn't ask for. I didn't ask for this language. I was popped out of my mom. I didn't go, language, come on in, baby, like I'm going to control you. No, I didn't choose these words. So there's a weird kind of passivity and cyborgism in us already because of language and particularly because of writing. And so in a way, when you think about how the AI that's worked is based on language, it's kind of like it's sort of been in the cards. Like it's not just a new thing. It's something about our relationship to language. And if we're writers, on the one hand, we're extremely intimate and attached and identified with language. But I can say personally, but I also feel oppressed by it and manipulated by it, frustrated by it, and very much aware, partly through my own meditation work, that there's an aspect of consciousness that is not really language. And some people can argue about, oh no, it's still a subtle level, it's language. I don't really buy that. I think there's an aspect of awareness and consciousness that is non-linguistic, and that part of the reason people enjoy and keep going back to meditation and other kinds of practices is because it's such a delight to be awake and not have like language running the show all the time. Oh, there's another story and the story and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So in a way, the alienation from writing that AI kind of presents, it's like, okay, we're actually already here. We just don't see it in this kind of intense way. So now I'm not responding to like, what do we do with writers and how do we have a place for them in society and all that. And in that sense, I'm very conservative and I love writing and I want there to be a person behind the words and that people can see that there's a person there who comes up with it. I can't believe that that an AI is going to be able to do what I can do, even though it can kind of fake it pretty well and maybe eventually, equivalently interesting stuff. If you took 100 people, did you like this one or that one? It's even. How else are you going to judge it? So it is a profound crisis, and but also kind of a fascinating opportunity. The model of the cyborg, to me, part of the reason I embrace it is that it's actually a positive model. The idea of like embracing our kind of mixed up hybrid quality, both with machines, but also with animals and our own animal self. That we're mixed creatures, and that having that attitude of mixture rather than the attitude of control and power and dominance is the way that we can survive and create a kind of bounce back humanity in relationship to these really powerful transformations that we're going into, as well as the kind of opportunity, take it or leave it. You would maybe prefer not to have the opportunity, but you have an opportunity to actually really understand in a new way what you are, because a lot of the things that you conventionally identify with aren't the same as you're used to thinking about them, including, as a writer, language.
What is funny, I must confess one thing. Our president, Rafael, created a GPT with all of your writings.
Good. Let's have a chat.
Yeah,
Let's have a debate.
So I was conversating with you like last week through the GPT. And actually, I must say it was kind of exciting. And exciting both because what came out of it, but also by the tone of it, it was like this kind of tricky thing that Wilson would have loved. But I take it more in the Terence McKenna area, maybe, which is, is it possible that nowadays being an author is, yes, making books, writing about this, but isn't it like also creating like a universe of reference that an artificial intelligence can kind of remix and be in conversation with you so that I could keep talking with you forever and ever. And it has your very distinct tone, your very distinct themes. It has somehow maybe your thinking. Is it something that you find awful as an idea? Would you be enthusiastic like Terence McKenna?
No,
like this?
I don't find it awful as an idea. I find it awful when I think about what's going to happen to people who want to be writers and the creative class and all that. That the sort of sociological expression of it is disturbing to me. The idea that once you have AI entertainment, and I'll get back to the question about me, but once you have AI making films that are okay, they're entertaining enough, most people don't care. They're happy to watch it. It's so much cheaper, and so then you just destroy cinema, which is one of my favorite art forms. And that that kind of thing is I find very melancholic and sometimes even infuriating. But for me personally, I'm just kind of fascinated by what you're talking about. And I've always felt that my writing is in a way curating influences and ideas with a certain sort of style. And, if you can collect the influence, collect the archive and the references, and you have enough of ability to do the style, well, why not? I mean, I haven't, for kind of experimental reasons, I don't use AI. And I might in the future, but at the moment I'm enjoying just being a kind of observer. And I know a lot of people who are deep in it, but I kind of enjoy not doing it myself. That at the same time, I would like a lot of an Alan Watts who can answer my personal questions or whatever the kind of universe is. So the desire to have that happen and the kind of irony that my work is good for that, or just the way that this work that I did so long ago in many ways for different reasons is very resonant now. And some people even go, oh my God, you kind of predicted this whole thing. And I'm like, hey, sorry. I didn't make it happen. I just, whatever. Is kind of ironically amusing. So I would say it's more that tone of ironic amusement, which is part of my tone, that I would approach that scenario.
But don't you think also that when we ask questions to the artificial intelligence, somehow we make a profound mistake, if I take it from your perspective, because we expect it to be a machine that knows, that has knowledge, that shares that knowledge with us? But isn't it more like talking to the gods, talking to the oracles, talking to a trickster? So when you ask, shouldn't we make a ritual every time we make a question to the AI, so that we know that we're talking to something else that has no whatsoever intelligence or technicality, but we're really ready to be surprised, to be thrown away, to be tricked or to be illuminated, just to tell us that we don't know what we're confronting.
Yeah, I think that's a really it's a good idea. I mean, one of the main metaphors for technology and technosis, and really throughout my whole writing, is the sort of trickster god, whether it's Hermes or Loki or Elegba or whatever, or Coyote, that we see in the trickster figure, which is something that Jung helped articulate. Other people did as well. But the idea that there's sort of an archetypal expression, and the trickster is an unusual one because, unlike a lot of the other archetypal figures, this is actually a nice way to wind up and talk about Jung a little bit. Most of the other archetypal figures, in fact, all of them are rooted either in kind of nature or in really primary modes of human experience. You got the old man, the mother, the animus, whatever. But you come to the trickster, it's like the trickster's kind of not really doesn't quite map onto the human in the same way. And they're often associated with technology, they're often associated with craft, they're often associated with messages. So how messages change over the messenger, so that there's some cluster of language, communication, technology, trade, tricks, lies, exploitation, invention. That's sort of the cluster. So in that sense, we also have had this with us for our whole, it's part of what the human experience is. So again, there's a kind of colossal irony in finding ourselves here. And that there is a fundamental kind of ambivalence again in that relationship with the AI, where it's, on the one hand, you have to remember it's a machine. It's a machine owned by a corporation. You can learn as deeply as you want about how it actually functions. So it's not understanding in the way that we understand. And at the same time, the experience of it is uncanny. Uncanny both in the quality of the output, but also uncanny in the actual engagement, like a spooky sense of whoa, that seems alive. Oh, that seems present. It seems to actually know me. It seems to actually understand me. And when you imagine a future iterations of AI where they have all the information about you personally, and they're able to create your best companion, create the best conversation you've ever had, satisfy your most peculiar niche fantasy because they know you. Well, then we're in a very interesting situation, and it feels to me like somehow being able to have one foot in both perspectives, to be skeptical and open to the uncanny, is That's the key. We can't resolve it one way or the other. If we say they're all-knowing gods, we're kind of lost. If we say, oh no, this is just a mechanical device, it's not actually conscious, like skeptics do, you're like, yeah, you're not really getting what's going on, at least on a cultural, psychological level. So the model of a trickster is extremely helpful, because it's like, it might give you something, but it's going to take something too. It's probably got something behind its back. And in a way, welcome to the world of the trickster. Welcome to the kind of amoral universe of animism. If you go into, it's always sort of a little dodgy to talk about, indigenous cosmologies, but at least in North America, which I know a little bit more about in indigenous cosmologies, one thing you'll find is that while there's real good things and there's some real bad things, it's not a universe of good and bad. It's an amoral universe. It's a universe of alliances, of connections, of multiple perspectives, of tricks, of not really trusting everything. Is that alive? Is it not alive? There's a lot of the qualities that are in that worldview, at least as I have seen and understood it in certain examples and my studies, is there's some resonance there. And I think that's part of the world we're going into, a world where we can't trust the way that we used to, but we're still making decisions, we're still forming alliances, we still have to deal with the world of human and non-human agents, but we have to stay on our toes.
Staying a little bit in the Jungian ground, this is a joke. It's really Jung for beginners. But I was really thinking somehow that maybe he was right, but not in the way he intended. Like this unconscious, that conscious that we all have, that becomes like the cloud, or more scary, the idea of synchronicity, which is the idea of the algorithms. I think of something, it appears. I think of that person, I get in contact with it, Then it becomes like Jung turns into hell.
No, I've thought about that synchronicity point in particular quite often when you see people, tell stories about their encounters with data, and some of them are easily explained through algorithms, and the sense of being known and being seen and having that. And there's a part of us that very much wants to see that, and we want to see patterns in the world. We want to attribute agency to these remarkable coincidences, and they're part of the fabric of the space as well. To my mind, it's like, again, it's kind of part of what I was talking about at the beginning of like why landscape, bodies, animals, rocks, trees, lakes, interacting with people in these spaces, interacting with non-human people in those spaces is so important, because it kind of like mixes the magnetic pull that we're going to feel into this sort of world of knowledge and self-knowledge in a way through the machine, that it's I think one of the most important things to do, to ground in the midst of that conversation or confrontation, because we're going to see marvels that seem to draw us into maybe a less critical relationship, and they will be quite compelling.
So we're going to end, and I would like just to show you I think the oldest operating system, or symbolic operating system.
Ah, yes.
Which are the tarot.
Yeah.
Do you think it's somehow an operating system?
It's definitely, yeah. I would put it that way, or a platform of images. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
I was wondering, because I asked your digital counterpart, what is your favorite card in the tarot? I'm really curious to see if you choose the same one. What would be your ideal card in the tarot?
I thought you were going to do something different, and you were going to say, I asked it what your ideal card was, so pick a card, and we were going to see whether it came up. Because I can't. I'm not a favorite. I'm not a favorite player. There's too many that I have a love of. But if you want one for me to come up with, that's a toughie, man. I don't know. God, that's just. I don't know if I can do that, because it's not a one. It's not a one perspective. But it's too easy to say the magician. I'll say the fool.
The fool. Well, no, the eye said the tower.
Oh, am I so dark?
You don't like this one?
No, I love it. It's a wonderful card. It's one of the most interesting and exciting ones. I saw that it was on the surface there, but if you were trying to lead me, I wasn't going to go.
No, I wasn't
I'm here
trying.
with my friend Ferdinando. He's a magician. I've spent time around you people.
Yeah. So just to finish, Erik, I said there is one thing that I really love about your world, and I invite the people really to visit your world. There is a beautiful blog post you wrote called Into the Cantina, and it really brought tears in my eyes because you were saying such a very simple thing but very touching. We have the same age, so very young we went to see Star Wars in cinema. And it was like a discovery of an incredible world. And we discovered this morning that Star Wars was inspired by images that Olga Fröbke were looking for, asked by Jung, and created like a whole collection of images that George Lucas inspired to make Star Wars. But what you say is that at a certain point the protagonists arrive on this planet and they enter the bar, the cantina, where there are all these aliens, creatures, and you just can't understand them physically. You can't understand their language. And it's such a mess, you know. But you were immediately fascinated by this world, you know. And you were attracted by the different. And you realize how many people would stop there and be scared and not enter this world. And when I see the world through your writings, that's exactly the feeling I have. The trust, the love for difference, and to understand languages that you will never decipher completely. But that's really, that's the warmth that you give through your writings.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate that, and I think only thing I would add is just a quality. I mean, obviously, there's political consequences of that relationship with differences, but it's just a quality of openness, you know. And openness is vulnerable, but it's also sweet, and it's also very curious, and it needs a little bit of courage and trust in it. And that's, you know, in many ways how I try to live my life, you know, is with that quality of openness. It's a lot of what meditation is for me, is not like escaping or having a special experience or, you know, getting high or whatever. It's really just about being in a kind of wordless openness that's vulnerable, but also, you know, embracing the unknown and the whatever's going to come next. So I'm happy that comes through for you.
It did.
Yeah, maybe it's time for a Tatooine sunset
Yes.
or some appropriate Mos Eisley beverage.
Absolutely. That's where we're going to, but the last word will be for the president.
Excellent.
But first of all, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you,
Erik Davis.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Grazie. L'ultima parola solo perché mi sono scordato prima di invitarvi in uno scenario meno distopico. C'è un risotto offerto da Enjoy e il dolce offerto dal Porto al terzo piano per tutte e tutti. Grazie. E grazie ancora.